All right, welcome back to The Download. I'm Reid Mercer, and this week the industry handed us 4 stories that all connect in ways that should keep network executives up at night. We want to hear from you. Submit questions via the web form in the description or give us a call at 747-234-2678 and leave your question. Don't be shy. Our AI assistant makes it super easy. Okay, so get this. Netflix and Spotify, 2 companies that have been quietly trying to eat each other's lunch for years, they just cut a joint deal for the same podcast. Together, the same content asset. Let that sit for a second. According to Variety's Todd Spangler, the deal is worth about $100 million for Jay Shetty's On Purpose, a self-help podcast with more than 5 million YouTube subscribers, multi-year, and 3 other companies were bidding. So this wasn't a handshake at a conference. There was a real auction. Now, the first question any sane person asks is, wait, why are Netflix and Spotify sharing anything? These platforms do not share. That is not a behavior pattern we have observed in the wild. Here's what I think is actually happening. Each platform has a ceiling it can't break through alone. Spotify has the audio infrastructure, the ad sales muscle. Hollywood Reporter confirmed Spotify is acting as the global sales rep on this deal. But Spotify doesn't have Netflix's video prestige or its subscriber base for discovery. Netflix gets the wellness audience it has been trying to crack without building a whole content vertical from scratch. Neither platform gets everything by going alone. So they split it. Now, stress test the math with me. $100 million. Forbes noted this is one of Spotify's biggest deals since Joe Rogan in 2020. Shetty's pulling serious numbers, but the monetization paths here have to work across 2 platforms simultaneously without cannibalizing each other. Audio stays on Spotify, video goes to both, but only to Netflix and Spotify starting July 13th. That means Shetty is pulling video off YouTube entirely. 5 million subscribers, gone from the free platform. That is a real trade-off, and somebody modeled it very carefully. Also worth noting, Shetty's iHeartMedia deal is ending in June per the Wrap, so the timing is not accidental. This is a clean handoff, and iHeart just watched a top creator walk out the door into a 9-figure joint venture between 2 streaming giants. The strategic read for every podcast network watching this is the deal structure. Not the number, not the creator. The fact that Netflix and Spotify decided a shared asset beats competing for one. That is new behavior, and it tells you something about where each platform thinks the real ceiling is. So, if 2 streaming giants are rewriting how they compete for depth, what does the platform that just hit 1 billion monthly podcast users actually do with that kind of scale? And speaking of platforms taking hits, let's talk about the one that just had a 1 billion user moment dropped on its doorstep. YouTube now has over 1 billion monthly podcast viewers. Podcast News Daily reported it this week. 1 billion. Let that number sit for a second, because if you're running a podcast network and you glossed over that headline, you need to go back and read it again. Here's the thing about scale like that. The milestone isn't the story. The strategy behind getting there is. YouTube didn't set out to build a podcast platform, it built a video platform, and podcasters dragged their content onto it because the audience was already there. Now YouTube is formalizing what the audience already decided. And this week, they made it official with a product push. According to TechCrunch's Aisha Malik, YouTube is rolling out new premium features including an AI recommendation tool and something called AutoSpeed. The AI recommendation piece is the one worth watching. YouTube is essentially training its algorithm to surface podcast content the way it surfaces everything else, which means it's applying the same discovery engine that made YouTube dominant in video to the podcast format. Think about what that does to the distribution math. Right now, a network executive is managing presence across Spotify, Apple, Amazon, and YouTube. But Spotify has roughly 675 million users. Apple Podcasts is substantial but opaque. Amazon is still assembling its audience. YouTube just told you it has 1 billion monthly podcast viewers. The distribution weight in that room has shifted. And here's the part that stings a little given what we just talked about with the Shetty deal. Jay Shetty is pulling video off YouTube. He had 5 million subscribers there.
His team made a calculated bet that the Netflix-Spotify money outweighs YouTube's organic reach. That math might work for him specifically, but most creators don't have that option. Most networks definitely don't. So the billion user number is really a negotiating lever. Every network that distributes on YouTube now has a data point that says this platform has scale no one else touches. The question is whether YouTube monetizes that for creators or just keeps it as house advantage.
And monetization is exactly where this gets interesting. Because while YouTube is building audience infrastructure, the ad market underneath all of this is doing something nobody predicted. The numbers coming out of Magellan AI's Q1 report are the kind of thing that rewrites international budget conversations. That's where we're headed. All right, flip that distribution story on its head for a second. YouTube's got the audience, but who's got the money moving fastest right now? Magellan AI dropped Q1 numbers this week, and non-US podcast ad spending is up 79% year over year. 79! That's not incremental growth, that's a category inflection. Magellan's full estimate puts global podcast ad spending near $4 billion for 2025 across major markets. $4 billion, much of it landing outside the US for the first time. So what does 79% actually mean for a network executive sitting in, say, New York or LA? It means your international revenue line is probably still sized for 2022. The budgets have already moved. The reallocation is happening with or without you. And then comes the ad tech layer. A company called Spots Now launched what they're calling an AI operating system for podcast advertising, covered by James Cridland at Podnace. The pitch is custom AI agents trained on each network's specific workflows, taking repetitive planning, vetting, and outreach off the sales team's plate. Small team, several times the throughput. Now, I've seen enough ad tech vendor decks to know the gap between the pitch and the product, but here's what I'd actually stress test. Does this solve a real workflow problem, or does it add one more system for an already stretched sales operation to manage? The networks that'll get value from this are the ones with enough volume that human bottlenecks are the actual constraint. Below a certain scale, it's overhead. The Ankler published a first-party interview with Spotify's podcast head Roman Wassenmuller this week, and it's worth reading directly rather than through a summary. He traces how Spotify's audio investments went from a money-losing drag to a profitable growth engine. The specific detail worth noting, they didn't pivot away from audio. They layered monetization on top of an audience they'd already built. That sequencing matters if you're a network trying to figure out where video investment fits. So the picture this week is accelerating money, smarter targeting tools, and a major platform finally telling its own monetization story publicly. The ad market is growing faster than most operators planned for. Which sets up a genuinely awkward problem. All this money's moving fast, globally, into an industry that still hasn't locked down a formal definition of what a podcast actually is. An industry task force is literally meeting right now to answer that question. And the reason it matters isn't academic. So, straight from the global ad surge eating the world, here's the punchline of the week. The podcast industry has formed a task force to decide what a podcast is. I know how that sounds. Hollywood Reporter, Barrett Media, TV News Check, all covering it this week. An industry task force to define a podcast in 2026. We've been doing this for 20 plus years, and apparently we still don't have a clean answer. But here's the thing. Barrett Media ran a piece calling it an exercise the industry needs but can't win, and that framing is exactly right. The humor is the hook. The consequences are not funny at all. Seriously, think about what hinges on this. Ad spend allocation, Nielsen comparisons, platform reporting. When advertisers sit down to buy, they need to know what bucket the money goes into. Oxford Road CEO Dan Granger put it plainly in the Hollywood Reporter piece. Without a definition, advertisers are deciding whose budget this is to come out of, and the show gets orphaned. That's real money getting left on the table, or worse, going somewhere else entirely. And here's where my antenna go up. I talked last week about the Triton-Nielsen integration being the unlock for the next tier of brand budgets.
The entire logic of that argument depends on podcast audience data flowing into the same planning tools as TV buys. But if the industry can't agree on what counts as a podcast, what exactly is Nielsen measuring? The integration only works if the category is defined cleanly on both ends. The measurement stack is only as useful as the definitional foundation underneath it. Now, why can't this get resolved? Because the major players have completely conflicting incentives. YouTube counts 1 billion monthly viewers watching podcast content, but YouTube doesn't call itself a podcast platform. Spotify hosts the same shows and does. Netflix just bought into the space with the Shetty deal. They'll have their own reporting preferences. Everyone draws the line where it benefits them. Consensus is structurally hard when every definition creates winners and losers in the ad planning conversation.
So here's the forward read. If this task force actually produces a working definition by 2027, budget conversations with brand advertisers get a lot cleaner. Category spend goes up. If it stalls, which Barrett Media honestly suggests is more likely, then you're looking at continued fragmentation where measurement ambiguity caps how much institutional money flows in. The ad money we covered this week is moving fast. The infrastructure question is whether the industry can define the thing it's selling before the next wave of buyers gives up trying to figure it out. All right, that's a wrap on today's download. 3 things stuck with me from this one. The Netflix-Spotify joint deal structure, because these platforms do not share. And when they do, something interesting is happening at the ceiling of each platform's strategy. YouTube crossing 1 billion monthly podcast viewers, which isn't a milestone, it's a leverage point. And that task force quietly trying to define what a podcast even is, which sounds like a philosophical exercise until you realize it's actually a budget allocation problem. If you got something out of today, forward it to one person who needs to hear it. Tips and feedback, send them to thedownload@heymotto.com. Subscribe wherever you're listening, and we'll see you next time.